Good evening. Mrryanmcmahon here, inspired to read the work of Goethe, Johann Wolfgang Von Geothe. Hopefully you guys have all heard of Goethe. If not, you should know what he did and what he accomplished in his life. This video is not about that, but well worth looking at. He was a direct contemporary of Sir Isaac Newton at the time, studying gravity, light, color, physics, sound, and the natural sciences. I'm going to be reading one small chapter. It's about 3 pages from a book by Rudolf Steiner called Goethe's Theory of Knowledge, an outline of the epistemology of his worldview. So much of these words are Rudolf Steiner's interpretation of Goethe's work from German into English. And also, much of these words are actually Goethe's words, too. And we're going to be talking about cognition, thinking and reason, and how the human mind works. To me, this is fascinating stuff because I think in the current Western world, we've kind of lost the teachings of how to think, how to discern, how to follow truth and facts, or I should say how to follow facts to truth. And so really this whole topic, this chapter is really about epistemology. And what is epistemology? Epistemology is one of the 3 branches of philosophy. And epistemology is the study or pursuit of how we know what we know and how we can determine it to be true. So how do we know what is actually true? And when we find something that's true, how can we verify in a succinct way that what we know as gnosis or knowledge is in fact truth? Very important part of philosophy, maybe the most important part of philosophy itself. So I want to start with a quote real quick, just a couple lines. Goethe says, "Inasmuch as the members that enter the judgment are concepts, all judgments simply are the reunification of what the intellect has divided. The interconnection comes to light as soon as one enters the content of the intellectual concepts." So think about that. All judgment, all discernment of conceptual nature are simply the reunification, so the unity, of what the intellect has already divided. So if you understand that, then you realize that the intellect's duty or function is to divide things, to separate them. And it's not the intellect's duty to actually perform the task of reason or gnosis or knowledge. That is something beyond the intellect. Okay, moving on to the cognition. Chapter 13, the act of cognition. Goethe. Reality reveals itself to us in the 2 separate spheres of experience and thought. Experience must be considered in 2 ways. First, to the extent that the whole of reality, apart from thinking, has a form of manifestation that must appear in the form of experience. Second, to the extent that it is inherent in the nature of the human mind, whose essential nature consists in observation or outwardly directed activity, that the objects to be observed must enter its field of vision. That is, the objects must again be given to the mind in the form of experience. Okay, just a little quick aside. He's talking about the mind and how the mind works. And he's trying to get at what the mind actually is. So first, we find out that the mind's essential nature is in observation. And what he's saying is, all observation is outwardly directed activity. As long as your eyes are open, you're actually looking at the world outside of yourself, at the objects. So in a sense, there is some objectivity, but we don't really know what that objectivity actually is yet, how to define it. So, and then he goes on to say that this whole act of using the mind for what it's actually used for, this outward activity, has to be done through experience. So experience is the form, the function. I should say it's the function. It may be that this form of what is given does not contain the essential nature of the thing, in which case the thing itself requires that it first appear in perception, in experience, and only later reveal its essential nature to the mental activity that goes beyond perception. Another possibility is that the essential nature may be present in what is given directly, though we cannot be aware of this essential nature because of the second circumstance, the mind's requirement that everything appear before it as experience. The second possibility is true of thought. The first is true of all other reality. In the case of thought, it is necessary only to overcome one's subjective biases in order to gain this in its innermost essence. In the case of all other reality, what rests upon the actual situation in objective perception, that the immediate form of appearance must be overcome in order to explain it, rests, in the case of thought, only upon the peculiarity of the minds. So let me read that again. In the case of all other reality, what rests upon the actual situation in objective perception, that the immediate form of appearance must be overcome in order to explain it. In the case of thought, only upon peculiarity of our minds. So what he's saying is that the objects of the world present themselves to us, or we connect with them, we interact with them. But the only way we're able to actually even begin to use thought to think about those objects is through an experiential act. And that experience is our actual connection, our cognition of the object itself. So it's getting at that it's really not thought that is really defining the object. It's thought that has already been through an experience. So we're still at the ground, the foundation that experience is the foundation of what enables thought and perception to even occur. Okay, reading on. In the former case, the thing itself gives itself experiential form. In the latter, an experiential form arises from the organization of our mind. In the former case, we do not yet have the whole when we comprehend the experience. In the latter case, we do have it. So this makes me think a little bit of Jordan Peterson's explanation of Piaget. I think his name is Jean Piaget, but I could be wrong about his first name. Piaget, the French sociologist, talking about games and game theory. And one of the things that he points out in young mammals, and especially in humans and young children, is that we actually act out things before we understand what they are. So we go through our entire life acting out things that we don't understand. And it's through the acting out that we eventually become and gain an understanding of what we're actually doing. So it's back to that experience. We have to experience things before we can think about them. Okay, that's my take on it. Moving on. This is the basis for the dualistic notion that we must overcome knowledge, thinking, and cognition. People find themselves confronted by two worlds whose interrelationship they must bring about. One is experience, which we know contains only half of reality. The other is thought, self-complete, and into which the external experimental reality must flow before a satisfying worldview can come about. If the world were populated entirely by merely sense-bound creatures, its essential nature would remain hidden forever. Although laws would control the world processes, those laws would never become apparent. Before these laws can be made apparent, there must be, between the law and its form of manifestation, a being, who not only has the organs needed to perceive the sensory form of reality dependent upon the laws, but also the capacity to perceive the lawfulness itself. Both the sensory world itself and the ideal nature of this world must come to meet this being, who must unite the two factors of reality by means of reasoning activity. This is a very interesting point. He's leading us down a perception or an observation that we would never be able to discover the laws of nature if we didn't in fact experience them through perception. So the fact that we are able to uncover the laws of nature, you could say physics, and test them and discover them and then realize their patterns. The fact that we're able to do this, Goethe is saying, proves that we are using something that is beyond thought and beyond reason. He's actually pointing that it has to do with being itself. It takes a being to experience reality in order to articulate it eventually in word or in thought or in deed. Here, it must be obvious that our mind should not be regarded as a receptacle for the world of ideas containing the thoughts within itself. But the mind is an organ that perceives those thoughts. The mind is no less an organ of apprehension than are the eyes and the ears. Thought is related to our mind as light is related to the eye and sound to the ear. Surely no one would think of color as something that permanently impresses itself on the eye, remaining there as if it is adhered to it. Nonetheless, this is the prevailing view when it comes to the mind. It is presumed that thought of each thing forms itself in the consciousness and remains there to be brought forth as needed. One particular theory has been based upon this view, as if thoughts we are unaware of at the moment were preserved in our minds, lying just below the threshold of consciousness. Okay, another aside. I think it's very important to point this out because this is, in fact, one of the faults of modern day science. Is even though science is trying to map consciousness and using material instruments to attempt that, they still have fallen short of this basic awareness that the mind itself does not contain thoughts. The memory might contain images and ideas and concepts, but those aren't actually thoughts. But the mind itself, the way the mind works and its function, is not a receptacle for thoughts. It is a tool designed to think. And it's designed to think by using perception based on experience. So it's interesting to think about this in this way. The mind is not full of thoughts. And you don't have a bunch of thoughts just sitting in there and you recall them when you need them. What's actually happening when you feel that way is that you're not recalling some thought that's latent in your mind and has been there forever. You're actually cognizing in those moments, and you're actually using the mind for what it's supposed to do, and that's judge or discern or follow cognitive steps, follow the logos, or act as a logician, to discern, to add, to subtract, to refine and define. Okay, moving on. These strange opinions dissolve into nothing when we recall that the world of ideas is self-determined. What does this self-determined content have to do with the multiplicity of consciousness? One would hardly suppose that it determines itself with indeterminate multiplicity in such a way that one particular content is always independent of the other. The matter is perfectly clear. The content of thought is such that it requires only a mental organ for its manifestation, whereas a number of beings possessing such an organ is unimportant. Therefore, an indefinite number of beings endowed with minds may be confronted by a single thought content. The mind thus perceives the thought content of the world like an organ of comprehension. There is only a single thought content of the world. That's a pretty bold statement. There is only a single thought content of the world. Human consciousness does not constitute the ability to produce thoughts and store them up, as is generally believed, but rather the ability to perceive thoughts or ideas. Goethe expresses this excellently, quoting, "The idea is eternal and unique. The fact that we also use the plural is unfortunate. All things that enter our awareness and discussions are simply manifestations of the idea. We express concepts, and to that extent, the idea itself is a concept." Okay, another very interesting approach that Goethe is talking about. He's saying that there isn't ideas in the plural. There isn't like a bunch of ideas that exist in the universe. What he's saying is the universe has idea itself. It's a what is it? It's a state or an awareness or a unique signature of the universe itself. Idea exists eternally. And so when we have quote unquote ideas in the plural, we're not actually like coming up with a bunch of ideas. We're actually tapping into the essence of idea itself, which Goethe says is eternal. It exists throughout the universe because the universe is consciousness, or being or becoming. Okay. Living in these two worlds, that of the senses and that of thoughts, with one pressing in form below and the other shining down from above, human beings become masters of knowledge and thus unite the two into the undivided whole. From one perspective, the outer form calls to us. From the other, the inner being calls, and we must unite the two. Here, our epistemology has lifted itself above the views usually adopted by similar inquiries, which never go beyond formalities. It is said, knowing is the elaboration of experience, without determining exactly what is elaborated. The matter is defined by saying that in cognition, perception flows into thinking, or that thinking, by virtue of a certain inner compulsion, advances from the experience to the real entity behind it. But these are all mere formalities. An epistemology that tries to understand the important role of cognition in the world must first declare its ideal purpose. Okay, that should be pointed out. An epistemology in philosophy is trying to find out how we know what we know, and how we know that we know it, and how we know that it's actually true. And what he's saying here is that any epistemology that tries to understand an important role of cognition in the world must first declare its ideal purpose. So what is he saying there? He's saying that epistemologies are an aspect of being itself, and thus epistemologies have to serve a purpose. And what is that purpose? That's the question that the epistemology needs to define and answer. So what he's saying is, if you have a very weak epistemology or approach to the world, you will not really know the purpose of how you know what you know. If you have a very strong epistemology that's very sound, you will know exactly how you know what you know, and you will know why you know what you know. You will know what that purpose is. And in some sense, he's saying that being itself has purpose. And so a being with a strong epistemology will have purpose as well. Sort of the opposite of modern day cultural relativism. This involves offering a solution to unresolved experience by revealing its central core. Such a science must then determine the nature and content of the central core. It is thought, or the idea. Finally, it must show how to uncover the core. Thinking and Perception, in Chapter 11, explains this. Our epistemology leads to the positive conclusion that thought is the essential nature of the world, and that the individual human thinking is its form of the manifestation. A mere formal theory of knowledge cannot do this. It remains barren. It has no opinion on the relationship between what knowledge attains and the nature and activity of the world. And yet this relationship must be found in a theory of knowledge. So what he's saying is you're not really dipping into gnosis unless your epistemology is aware that you, the being itself, are a tool of cognition that the universe has created, and that you have, basically you have a purpose, you have a role to cognize, you have a role to help refine consciousness. Surely this science must show us where our knowledge is going to take us, and therefore where all our sciences will lead us. Only through an epistemology can we attain the view that thought is the central core of the world, because such a science shows the connection between thought and the rest of reality. Without a science that focuses its investigations on this relationship, how could we come to understand the relationship between thinking and experience? Moreover, how could we ever know that a certain spiritual or sensible entity is the elemental force of the world if we did not investigate its relationship to reality? Therefore, the discovery of the essential nature of a thing will always involve a return to the world's content of ideas. If we wish to stay with clear definitions and not grope around in uncertainties, we must not step outside the domain of this content. Thought is a whole in itself. It is self-sufficient and may not pass beyond without entering a void. In other words, it must not, when trying to explain something, resort to things not found within itself. Something that thought could not encompass would be an absurdity. Everything is resolved in thought and eventually finds its place there. Okay, those are some serious deep dive in mental somersaults that he's talking about. It's pretty phenomenal stuff to think about, no pun intended. He's saying that the essential nature of the universe is thought or thinking. But I think he's already stated that the essential nature of the universe is actually being. Okay, moving on. In terms of our individual consciousness, this means that if we wish to establish anything scientifically, we must limit ourselves completely to what is given to us in consciousness. The error of believing that human knowledge is limited arises when we realize that we cannot skip over our own consciousness without finding ourselves in unreality, but do not also perceive that the essential nature of things exists within our consciousness in the act of perceiving ideas. If we cannot go beyond our consciousness, and if the essential nature of reality is not within consciousness, then we can never find our way to that essential nature. Our thinking is then bound to this one side and knows nothing of what is beyond. According to our point of view, however, such an opinion is simply thinking that misunderstands itself. Limits to knowledge would be possible only if external experience itself forced us to inquire into its nature and determine the questions we asked about it. But this is not the case. The need arises in thinking to hold up its own essential nature to experience as it perceives this experience. Thinking can have only a definite tendency to see its own lawfulness in the rest of the world, but never anything of which thinking is ignorant. So what I get out of that is he's saying that there are no limits to cognition. There are no limits to the power of thought. And yes, not everybody has the same level of perception or perceptual awareness or perceptual prowess. But what he's saying is that the thought that thinking has a limit sets the limit upon itself, which actually shows that thinking actually has no limit. Interesting. Okay, finishing up here. Another fallacy must also be rectified at this point. The belief that thinking is insufficient to constitute the world, as if something else, some other force, will, or whatever, must be added to the capacity of thinking in order to render the world possible. As soon as we reflect sufficiently, however, we see that all such factors actually amount to nothing but abstractions drawn from the perceptual world, which must themselves wait to be explained by thought. Other than thought, every component of the world would require a form of apprehension or cognition other than thought. These other components we would have to apprehend in ways other than through thought. After all, thinking yields only thoughts. However, we already contradict ourselves if we want to explain the roles of these components in the activities of the world, and thus must resort to concepts for this explanation. Moreover, apart from sensory perception and thought, there is no third capacity given to us. And if we cannot consider any part of the sensory perception to be the core of the whole, since closer inspection of all of its constituents shows that, as such, they do not contain its essential nature, this essential nature can, therefore, be found exclusively in thought. Okay, Goethe's theory of knowledge, as determined by his pupil, Rudolf Steiner. Fantastic book to look through if you want to know the nature of reality, consciousness, and philosophy itself, epistemology. And keep in mind, this is just one chapter that I just read that's about 3 pages long. This entire book is incredibly dense and has a ton of wisdom. Please check it out. Thanks for listening. Please share.